When Donald Trump slapped surprise tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China, the world didn't see it coming. His first move? A hefty 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico, while China got hit with a 10% rate. At first, these tariffs were put on pause for 30 days, but Trump made it clear they were coming back in full force on March 4th. China, on the other hand, never got a break. But the real shocker? Trump had his sights set on Canada, hitting them harder than expected. He didn't just raise tariffs, he took it a step further. His solution to the whole trade dispute? Canada should just join the United States. That's right, he floated the idea that Canada should become America's 51st state. Think about it, he argued. No border issues, no trade fights. They don't spend much, and we'd be raking in hundreds of billions in tariffs. We'd be so rich, you wouldn't even know what to do with all that money. To drive his point home, Trump threatened even steeper tariffs. He proposed a staggering 250% tariff on Canadian dairy products, and hiked the planned steel and aluminum tariffs to 50% instead of the original 25%. And if that wasn't enough, he warned that he could deal a final blow by shutting down Canada's auto manufacturing industry entirely. But then, something changed. Canada made a bold move of its own, holding back a new electricity tariff aimed at the US. In response, both countries agreed to reopen trade talks, leading Trump to back down. Yet Canada wasn't done. Instead of folding under pressure, they fought back with their own countermeasures. And as tensions grew, other global competitors saw an opportunity to step in, shaking up the trade game even more. Now let's dive into what Canada did next, how the US responded, and how America's biggest rivals tried to turn this tariff war to their advantage. But first, we would love to ask you a question. Would you want Canada to join the US and become the 51st state so Donald Trump can drop the tariff? Or Canada can do pretty well by itself without the US? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. Ontario Premier Doug Ford isn't one to back down from a fight, especially when it comes to protecting his province. So when word got out that President Trump was planning to slap a 25% tariff on Canadian goods, Ford had a bold response. He was ready to turn off the power supply to the US. "If they push us, I won't think twice. I'll shut it down completely," Ford declared. Speaking at a mining convention in Toronto, Ford made it clear that if the US wanted to make things difficult for Ontario, he was more than willing to hit back just as hard. And he wasn't just talking tough, he was ready to act. Since Ontario is one of the biggest electricity suppliers to the US, cutting off that energy flow would be a serious move. Ford promised that if Trump went through with his tariff plan, Canada would respond in kind. "We'll match them dollar for dollar," he told reporters. He also pointed out that both federal and provincial governments in Canada were standing together against the tariffs, determined not to let Trump's trade war go unanswered. Ford's fiery comments came shortly after Trump made it official. The 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico would take effect the very next day. The president also warned that any country imposing import taxes on American goods would face similar penalties starting April 2nd. But Ford wasn't backing down. If Trump thought Canada would simply accept the tariffs without a fight, he was wrong. And as tensions escalated, Ford did something unexpected. He turned to the American people themselves. "I want to apologize to the people of the United States," he said. "We all know this isn't about them. This is about one person, President Trump." Ford made it clear that Canada had no choice but to respond. It wasn't about picking a fight, it was about standing up for Canadians. And if that meant flipping the switch on energy exports, so be it. Ontario is not holding back in its response to the escalating trade war with the United States. The province isn't just threatening power cuts, it's cutting ties with American companies, starting with one of the biggest names in tech, Elon Musk's Starlink. In a dramatic move, Premier Doug Ford announced that Ontario was scrapping a $100 million contract with Starlink, Musk's satellite internet company. But that's not all. The province is also banning US businesses from bidding on government contracts, shutting them out of Ontario's lucrative procurement market. This is Ford making good on his promise. A month ago, before Canada and the US agreed to a temporary 30-day pause on tariffs, he warned that Ontario wouldn't sit back and take the hits. Now, with the trade war heating up again, he's following through. The Starlink deal, signed in November, was supposed to bring high-speed internet to 15,000 homes and businesses in Ontario's remote regions by mid-2025. But now, it's dead in the water. Speaking at a press conference, Ford didn't mince words. "We're tearing up the contract with Starlink. It's over. We won't do business with companies that back economic attacks on our province and our country." When reporters pressed him on the cost of canceling the deal, Ford admitted he wasn't sure, but promised to find out. But this wasn't just about money. It was personal. Ford took a direct shot at Musk, calling it ironic that the billionaire, who once studied at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, was now aligned with policies that hurt the very country that had helped him. "Elon Musk should be ashamed of himself," Ford said. "Canada gave him opportunities, and now he's turning his back on us." The Starlink cancellation is just the beginning. Ontario is putting a freeze on all future contracts with US companies, a move that could impact billions of dollars in business. The province spends around $30 billion a year on procurement, and now that money will be staying in Canada. Ford is even calling on provincial utilities and government ministries to comb through existing contracts and cut ties wherever possible. And this shift isn't just happening at the government level. Everyday Canadians are joining in. A growing movement encouraging consumers to buy Canadian is gaining traction, with apps like Buy Beaver helping shoppers support local businesses instead of American ones. Doug Ford isn't just relying on public support to push back against US tariffs. He's ready to take action himself. While he praised the growing number of apps that encourage Canadians to buy local, he also warned retailers. Either clearly label Canadian and American-made goods, or the government will make it law. And that's not the only leverage Ontario is considering. Ford is looking at a much bigger pressure point: critical minerals. He revealed that Ontario supplies around half of the key minerals the US depends on for manufacturing. That includes high-grade nickel, a crucial resource for industries like automotive and technology. If necessary, he made it clear, Ontario is ready to tighten its grip on those exports. This move adds yet another layer of tension to the growing trade conflict between Canada and the US. After President Trump officially announced on March 4th that his administration would move forward with tariffs on Canadian and Mexican imports, Canada wasted no time in responding. On March 3rd, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau issued a firm statement. Canada would not stand by while the US imposed unfair trade barriers. His government rolled out a sweeping counter-tariff plan, mirroring the response he had previously outlined in February when Trump first signed an executive order triggering the tariff battle. Justin Trudeau isn't just pushing back against US tariffs, he's hitting back hard. His first move? A 25% tariff on 30 billion Canadian dollars worth of American goods, set to kick in the moment the clock strikes 12:01 a.m. in New York, unless the US backs down first. And that's just the beginning. 3 weeks later, a second wave of tariffs will roll out, targeting an even bigger chunk of trade: 125 billion Canadian dollars worth of American exports. This round will hit major industries, including automobiles, steel, and aluminum, products that are critical to US manufacturing and jobs. Trudeau made one thing clear: these tariffs won't be going anywhere until the US reverses its own trade restrictions. And if the standoff continues, his government is ready to take things even further. Canada's provinces and territories are already in talks to introduce additional economic measures beyond tariffs, ones that could squeeze US industries in ways Washington might not see coming. But Canada's response isn't just about trade, it's about security too. The federal government has announced a 1.3 billion Canadian dollar plan to reinforce border protections, ramping up aerial surveillance with drones and helicopters to monitor key trade routes. While the US and Canada lock horns, another global power is watching closely: China. Beijing sees an opportunity in this escalating feud, one that could work in its favor. Here's why. The United States relies heavily on Canadian energy, Canada supplies 80% of its oil exports to the US, and American homes and businesses, especially in regions like New England, depend on Canadian hydroelectric power. Canada also ships vital resources like potash for fertilizers and uranium for nuclear energy. Now imagine if those resources started flowing somewhere else. China, which is constantly looking for reliable energy sources beyond Russia and Iran, could swoop in to secure Canada's oil and other energy supplies at competitive prices. And with tensions rising, Trudeau has a powerful bargaining chip in his hands, one that could change the entire dynamic of this trade war. The timing couldn't be better for Canada. Just this past May, the long-awaited expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline was completed, finally giving Canadian oil a direct route to global markets instead of relying solely on the United States. The numbers tell the story. Oil exports from the Port of Vancouver skyrocketed by 527% thanks to the new pipeline, helping Canada break free from its long-standing dependence on the US energy market. Tankers filled with Canadian crude are already sailing toward China, Japan, and other international buyers, signaling a major shift in the country's trade strategy. And if tensions with the US continue, Canada might just decide to strengthen those new trade relationships even further. Donald Trump's aggressive trade tactics have put Canada in a tough spot, but they may also be pushing the country toward a major transformation. The recent success of the $34 billion Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion has given Canada a new sense of independence, one that could reshape its role in the global oil market. For years, Canada's energy sector has been heavily tied to the US, sending the vast majority of its oil south. But with Trump's tariff threats creating uncertainty, many in the industry are looking east, toward China. Adam Waterous, an oil executive and former investment banker, believes the Trans Mountain expansion is just the beginning. He sees it as a stepping stone for Canada to break away from its reliance on American buyers and forge stronger trade relationships with other global powers. And right now, China is at the top of that list. If Canada makes the right moves, Beijing could become its biggest energy customer, securing a stable market for Canadian oil while reducing dependence on the unpredictable policies of its southern neighbor. Of course, shifting away from the US isn't easy. Canada's oil industry has long struggled with challenges in building new pipelines, facing pushback from environmental groups, indigenous communities, and government regulators. Many proposed projects have been stalled or scrapped altogether due to legal battles and political roadblocks. But that might be changing. After Trump's latest tariff threats, frustration with the US is at an all-time high. The trade dispute has left many Canadians feeling betrayed, and even hockey fans have started voicing their anger. Some have gone so far as to boo the American national anthem at games. Amid this growing discontent, two major pipeline projects that were once shelved are now back in discussion: Energy East and Northern Gateway. The Energy East project would repurpose an existing natural gas pipeline to carry over 1 million barrels of crude oil per day from Alberta and Saskatchewan to refineries in Ontario and Quebec, with the potential to reach international buyers through a shipping terminal in eastern Canada. Meanwhile, Northern Gateway would give Alberta oil direct access to the Pacific, opening up new export opportunities in Asia. If revived, these projects could significantly shift Canada's energy strategy, moving it away from US dependence and toward a more diverse, globally focused oil market. One of the biggest game changers in Canada's energy shift would be reducing its reliance on pipelines that run through the US, especially Enbridge's Line 5, which currently moves crude oil into Ontario and Quebec. For years, Canada's oil producers have been stuck with limited options for getting their product to international buyers. One potential solution was the Northern Gateway Pipeline, a project that would have transported over 500,000 barrels of oil per day from Alberta to the Pacific port of Kitimat, British Columbia. It was designed to open the door to Asian markets, giving Canada a much-needed alternative to US buyers. But that plan never made it off the ground. In 2016, the project was blocked by the courts after opposition from environmental groups and indigenous communities. Later that year, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau officially rejected it. Now, with growing tensions between Canada and the US, Some industry leaders argue that it's time to declare an energy emergency and fast-track the construction of new pipelines like Northern Gateway and Energy East, which would move crude to refineries in eastern Canada. Adam Waterous, chairman of oil producer Strathcona Resources, believes these projects should be revived immediately, before U.S. trade policies shift again. Yet, pipeline companies aren't all on board. Enbridge, which was originally behind Northern Gateway, has made it clear that it has no interest in reviving the project. Instead, the company is focused on expanding capacity in its existing network. Meanwhile, TC Energy, the company behind Energy East, has remained silent on whether it would consider bringing the project back. Even if the industry were to support these pipelines, the reality is that building new infrastructure is a long and expensive process. The Trans Mountain expansion, which nearly tripled the pipeline's capacity to 890,000 barrels per day, saw its costs skyrocket more than 6 times the original estimates by the time it was completed. Canadian taxpayers ended up footing the bill after the government stepped in and purchased the project from Kinder Morgan in 2018 to keep it from being scrapped. Beyond cost, any new pipeline proposal would still face intense pushback from environmental groups. Keith Stewart, a senior strategist at Greenpeace Canada, argues that the oil industry is using the trade crisis as an excuse to weaken environmental protections and push through controversial projects. Given these roadblocks, some experts believe the fastest solution isn't to build something new, but to expand what's already working. Trans Mountain still has room to grow. While it was built to handle 890,000 barrels per day, it's currently operating at only 80% of its full potential due to high shipping costs. By increasing pumping capacity, producers believe they could boost output by 200,000 to 300,000 barrels per day without major new construction. At the same time, the pipeline's marine terminal in British Columbia is still ramping up. Right now, the dock is handling around 480,000 barrels a day, but upgrades at the port are expected to push that number to 630,000 barrels daily by mid-year. That means more tankers carrying Canadian oil could soon be heading to international markets, reducing reliance on U.S. pipelines and buyers. Even at its current levels, Trans Mountain is already shaking up global oil markets. Countries that once relied on sanctioned suppliers, like China, Iran, and Russia, are now turning to Canada for oil. This shift is putting pressure on oil prices worldwide, especially for Middle Eastern and Latin American suppliers that produce similar heavy crude. At the same time, Canadian oil prices had been rising steadily, until the latest tariff threats threw everything into uncertainty. With the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion now in full swing, Canada is no longer just talking about diversifying its oil exports, it's actively doing it. And one country in particular is taking full advantage: China. According to a recent analysis by the China Institute at the University of Alberta, China has rapidly emerged as a major buyer of Canadian crude, thanks to the new pipeline capacity. Many assumed that most of this oil would go to refineries in California, but the numbers tell a different story. Early data reveals that a huge portion of the new exports isn't heading to the US at all. It's going straight to China. This marks a major turning point for Canada, which has long been overwhelmingly dependent on the US as its primary oil customer. And the timing couldn't be more critical. With relations between Canada and the US strained by tariffs and trade disputes, China has stepped in as a major alternative buyer. Between May and November 2024, Canada shipped nearly $2 billion worth of crude to China, according to a January 2024 report from LinkedIn Real Estate. That's about half of all the new oil being exported through the TMX pipeline. Leading the charge is Rongsheng Petrochemical, a massive Chinese oil company that runs refineries along the country's east coast. One of their biggest facilities, in Zhejiang province, alone processes 800,000 barrels per day, more than enough to absorb Canada's growing exports. This shift in the oil trade isn't just a win for Canada, it's a major wake-up call for the United States. For decades, America had a near-total monopoly on Canadian crude. Now, thanks to TMX, that dominance is being challenged like never before. And if Canada ever decided to redirect even more of its oil away from the US and toward China, it could seriously shake up the global energy market and the White House. From Canada's perspective, this pivot isn't just about economics, it's about self-preservation. Trade experts in Ottawa argue that President Trump's tariff war has put Canada in a position where it has no choice but to explore new partners. And the stakes are enormous. Every year, Canada and the US exchange over $900 billion in goods and services, making it one of the biggest trade relationships in the world. But thanks to the ongoing tariff dispute, that relationship is under strain. The uncertainty is already rattling the markets. The Canadian dollar has taken a hit, and the S&P/TSX Composite Index recently saw its biggest drop since December 18th, falling 1.5% in a single session. Investors are reacting fast. Overnight trading swaps suggest there's now nearly an 80% chance that the Bank of Canada will cut interest rates by 25 basis points at its next meeting on March 12th. And it's not just speculation. The Bank of Canada has warned that if the trade war drags on, it could shrink the country's economy by up to 3% over the next 2 years, slowing down growth in the process. In short, Trump's tariffs have hit Canada hard, and Canadians are responding in kind. Instead of folding under pressure, they're using every possible lever to push back, from energy exports to trade policy. And the full impact of these moves is just starting to unfold.